Marcus, a tired judge, just wanted to grab dinner after a long day. But to the police, he looked like a suspicious black man, and they decided to show their authority. Were they wrong? Soon they'd pay a price they'd never expect. Let's start from the beginning. The city center lay in the quiet stillness of late evening, its muted glow broken only by the occasional flicker of a street lamp and the soft neon lights of closed-up shops. Marcus, a tall, commanding black man in his late 40s, walked down the sidewalk with a quiet dignity that could only come from years of experience in the courtroom. He wore a dark blue suit, tailored and sharp, the kind that radiated authority even as he carried the weariness of the day in his steady stride. This evening, like many others, he had decided to treat himself to a small comfort, takeout from his favorite corner cafe. Parking his black sedan by the curb, he stepped inside the cafe, giving a nod and a quick smile to the barista, who recognized him instantly. There was an unspoken camaraderie there, a familiarity born of his regular visits. A few minutes later, Marcus emerged from the warm glow of the cafe, a bag of food in hand, its aroma carrying the promise of a simple, satisfying meal. He paused, briefly savoring the scent of the spices before unlocking his car and sliding into the driver's seat, allowing himself a moment of rare relaxation as he closed the door behind him. But just as he started the engine, red and blue lights flooded his rearview mirror, cutting through the calm. He blinked, confused, as a police patrol car pulled up behind him, effectively blocking his path. Two white officers stepped out. The first officer, stocky with a square jaw and short blonde hair, moved toward the driver's side window with an air of authority that bordered on aggression. The second officer, tall and lean, crossed his arms and watched with a look of thinly veiled disdain. The shorter officer leaned in, voice dripping with feigned friendliness. "Evening, sir. Mind telling us what you're doing here at this hour?" His eyes roamed over Marcus's attire, noting the suit that didn't quite fit his narrow stereotype of a suspicious figure. Marcus took a breath, keeping his tone level and controlled. "I just picked up some dinner. Heading home now," he replied. His words were straightforward, polite, but behind them was a subtle tension, an unspoken warning that he wasn't someone to be underestimated. The second officer stifled a chuckle, glancing at his partner as if to share an inside joke. "Heading home, huh? Maybe we ought to check your ID before you go anywhere," he said, his tone mockingly casual. Marcus felt the stirrings of irritation, but he kept his composure, reaching for his wallet with deliberate slowness. The officers seemed to pick up on his restraint, their expressions tightening as though they could sense a challenge. The stockier officer's hand dropped to his belt, his fingers hovering near his flashlight. "Why don't you step out of the car, sir? Just so we can make sure everything's in order." Marcus's hand stilled on his wallet. He looked up, meeting the officer's gaze with a steady, unyielding stare. In that moment, a subtle but undeniable shift took place. The look in his eyes carried the weight of 1,000 judgments, the authority of a man used to making decisions that shaped lives. This was no suspicious black man they'd stereotyped, but a judge. Someone who knew the law as intimately as they did, and perhaps even better. The late-night scene in the city center grew thick with tension, the dim lights casting long shadows over Marcus and the two officers who now stood firmly by his car. The stocky officer's flashlight beam lingered on Marcus's face, bright and invasive, as if daring him to look away. "Your ID, now," he demanded, his tone cold and unyielding. Marcus calmly reached for his wallet, pulling out his driver's license and handing it over. The officer held it up, examining it with disinterest, barely glancing at the details. His eyes shifted back to Marcus with a scrutinizing look, his voice sharp and mocking. "You're awfully calm for someone getting stopped by the police, almost like you've got something to hide," he said, as though testing Marcus's patience. Marcus met the officer's gaze, his tone measured but unshaken. "I'm simply following your instructions, officer. I don't see any reason to be concerned." His response, spoken with quiet authority, only seemed to fuel the officer's irritation. The taller officer stifled a laugh, leaning toward his partner. "Hear that? No reason to be concerned. Maybe he's hiding something. What do you think?" Marcus decided not to reveal his position as a judge just yet, hoping the officers would realize their own overreach, but their demeanor only grew more hostile. The taller officer moved closer, his posture now overtly challenging. Out here in the middle of the night, all dressed up, no answers? Looks suspicious to me. Maybe you'd rather explain it down at the station, he said with a sneer, raising an eyebrow as if to assert control. As their voices rose, a small crowd began to gather around, drawn by the unusual scene. Some stood back, watching with wary expressions, while others edged closer, curiosity and concern on their faces. A young man in a tracksuit lifted his phone, recording the interaction, while a few passers-by exchanged nervous glances, sensing the simmering tension in the air. Noticing the attention, the officer seemed emboldened. The stocky officer raised his voice, his tone sharp with a growing hostility. "Are you going to comply, or do we need to take you out of the car ourselves?" he said, stepping forward aggressively. The threat hung in the air, amplifying the already heavy silence as the crowd watched, tense and expectant. Frustrated by Marcus's calm defiance, the stocky officer clenched his jaw, stepping back to his radio. He cast a cold glance at Marcus, muttering something about a suspicious violator, and requesting additional backup. Within minutes, another patrol car arrived, pulling up with a sense of urgency. Out stepped a sergeant in his 40s, his uniform slightly worn, his gaze sharp and authoritative. He had the look of someone who'd seen it all, someone who knew when things weren't quite right. The sergeant's discerning eyes swept over the scene, lingering on Marcus for a beat longer. There was a flicker of recognition and a subtle shift in his expression that the other officers missed. Slowing his stride, the sergeant approached the two officers with a measured nod, his voice low yet firm as he addressed them. "Do you two even know who you're dealing with?" he asked, his tone layered with both authority and a touch of controlled frustration. The officers looked at each other in confusion, momentarily caught off guard. Their assured postures faltered as they exchanged uncertain glances. Meanwhile, Marcus, sensing the tide turning, quietly stepped out of his car. With a steady hand, he reached into his jacket, producing his judge's badge. He held it out, his expression still composed, but his calm carried a weight that made the officers shift uncomfortably. The officers' faces, once set with confidence and arrogant authority, quickly lost their smugness. The stockier officer swallowed hard, his eyes darting away from Marcus, while his taller partner looked down, the color draining from his face as the full scope of their misjudgment set in. In the surrounding silence, broken only by the hushed murmurs of the growing crowd, the realization of their mistake loomed heavily. They stood there, visibly flustered and embarrassed, fully aware that their prejudice had led them to target a man of significant authority. The sergeant cast them a withering glance, his silence speaking volumes as he turned back to Marcus, a silent apology lingering in his expression. The officers, now stripped of their bravado, were left standing awkwardly, their overreach and rash judgment painfully exposed for all to see. Taking a deep breath, Marcus decided to forego an open scandal, but seized the opportunity to teach these officers a valuable lesson. He gestured for all the officers to stay and gather around. The police, who had moments earlier appeared so self-assured, now looked visibly embarrassed and even worried, standing in awkward silence before the respected judge. "Do you realize what your actions just accomplished?" Marcus began in a calm but firm tone, his voice filled with restrained authority. He looked each officer in the eye, pausing as if to impress upon them the seriousness of what had just happened. "When you decide to belittle someone because of how they look, or because you assume they don't hold any influence, you erode trust in yourselves and the entire system you represent." The younger officers stood with their heads lowered, visibly understanding they had overstepped. Marcus continued, explaining that their actions not only violated professional standards, but also had serious consequences for the public's trust in law enforcement. "I am a judge," he said calmly, "but above all, I am a citizen, just like everyone else. Today it's me, but tomorrow you might treat someone the same way who cannot defend their rights." His words, delivered with firmness, struck the officers like a cold wave. They exchanged glances, feeling a mounting sense of guilt. I won't file a complaint against you, Marcus concluded, but only because I believe each of us can learn and strive to be better. He paused and added sternly, However, rest assured that tomorrow both of you will undergo retraining and you'll be under strict supervision. These final words served as a clear warning. The officers nodded, pale and visibly ashamed. They understood the judge had given them a second chance instead of the public rebuke that could have ended their careers. Satisfied with the effect of his words, Marcus slowly returned to his car, signaling that the conversation was over.